In this video, we're going to take a look at methods and how they're used in C#. We're going to look at how they're constructed and used. This is not meant as a demo video. You can take a look at the correlating methods demo if you want some hands-on experience working with methods. We're going to cover first how to define methods. Next, we'll talk a little bit about parameters. We're also going to look at return values with methods and also some built-in Unity methods. To start with the basic syntax of methods, there are some requirements that you do need to make sure you are keeping in mind when you're declaring them. The first part when you start writing a method is the return type. And this is the type of data that will get returned at the end of your method. It's possible that you're creating a method that doesn't return anything, so we would take that into account as well at the beginning, and we'll go over that later on in this lesson. You also need to give a unique name to your method, and it should start with a capital letter. And we're going to go over naming in more detail in a second. Your name should end in parentheses afterwards, and then we use the open and close curly brackets to mark the body of the method. So we have an open one, we have our code for this specific method, and then we have a closed bracket at the end. Naming methods. Methods have some rules, just like naming variables has some rules. And the first one is that you should always make sure that your method is a meaningful name, and it should be related to what the method is going to do. If you remember that methods are what our program uses to do things. So they're things that this script should be able to do. So usually your method should be named in that capacity. So you shouldn't be naming things like method 1 or method 2. It should be things like get score, update text, spawn enemies, and those kind of names make it very obvious of what the code inside of that method is going to accomplish. Also, like variables, method names can't have any spaces in them. So make sure that if you are using multi-word names, that there's no space between those words. And your method names need to start with a letter. So don't put any numbers to start your method names. For capitalization, if you remember, variables use camel case, but methods use something called Pascal case. And the big difference between that is that the first letter needs to be an uppercase letter, which is different than variables. And then afterwards, each word that you have in your name is also capitalized with no space. So, these are examples down here of methods that are named appropriately. The next thing you do need to keep in mind with methods is that you do have to choose a security level for them. This is slightly different than variables, where every method does need a security level, where variables, we only really needed to worry about those for class level. But methods always need a security level. By adding the access modifier to the beginning of your method, where it's kind of like a security setting, and it's, again, just like variables, where we're seeing if we want to be able to access this method outside of the script. So by making things public, if you make your method public, it'll be available to any script without restrictions, and this also makes it visible to other things in the Unity editor. They can look at that method on the script. If you set things to private, that means the method is only available to the script they are created in, and this is the default. If you forget to add public or private to the beginning of your method, it will default to private. So if you later on in the course, when we get to more advanced scripts, if you are trying to access a method in the Unity editor and you can't, most likely you forgot to set the security level. You probably just left it blank. You do need to go back and make sure that you add a public access modifier to the beginning. So here are some examples. So public or private is always the very first thing that you put down. And then the return type, and then its name and parentheses. Parameters are variable placeholders that can be passed into the method so they can be accessed from inside of them. And you can have as many input parameters as you want, but you need to make sure that you tell it what data type it is, and each of the parameters need a unique name. When we are writing out our parameters, they are separated by a comma. And the parameters go inside of the parentheses right here. And this makes it so whatever information you're passing on is accessible inside the body of the method. This is where that idea of scope comes in. If you are calling this method, usually in another method, and you have variables local to that other method, they won't be accessible in this one. We can send that information to that method through the parameter. And I'm going to kind of show this a little bit more in a couple minutes, actually looking at code to help kind of push this idea a little bit. But so once we get through a couple more things. The way that we call our methods is that we just use its name followed by parentheses and a semicolon. And the one really important thing that you do need to remember about methods is that they won't run unless they're called. And this is an area that sometimes students kind of forget, that even if you type in a method somewhere in your script, if it's never called inside of another one that's actually running, so for instance, your start method, that method doesn't ever run its code. So if you're ever having an issue where you don't understand why your method isn't running, try to find where in your code you're actually calling that method. You might have forgotten to do that. So the way that we do it is for example, down here, if we create this custom method called add numbers, and we need to send it an int, 2 ints, because we're going to add them together. We're going to call that in start, because if you remember, start is a Unity specific method that always runs at the beginning of the script. So inside of there, we're calling add numbers. We just write the name the same way as here. We then have our parentheses, and since it's asking for 2 integers, we have to send it 2 integers. So what happens is when the script runs, it's going to say, hey, start. Okay, we're going to start. It's going to go inside. It's going to hit add numbers. It's going to then locate where that one was written in your script. It's going to say, is your first one an integer? Did you send an integer? Okay. First is equal to 5. We also need another integer called second, which is going to be equal to 6. Keep in mind that if you do use parameters, you need to make sure that you do send it to them. If we had forgotten to send anything, we just kind of left the parentheses blank, you're going to get an error because it's expecting them. You also need to make sure that you're putting them in the correct order. So if this first one was an int and the second one was a string, we would need to put them in order of int and string. We can't just throw them in any order that you want. Otherwise, you're going to get errors. Okay, so start fires, we say add numbers with sending these. It comes down to here. It fires this code where it's going to print to the console these 2 numbers added together, and then it's done. Then it would return back to start and continue on. This particular one doesn't have anything after it, so then start would be over after add numbers runs. The other important thing to talk about with these is the return values. If you remember from at the beginning, is we do need to specify a return type when we define our methods. And what this is, let me go back, oops, sorry, is that methods return data back to where they're called from when that method is completed. You can only return one piece of data, and you have to specify what that data type is when you define the method. So for instance, in this example down here, when this is done, we want to return an integer because we're going to return what happens when you add these two numbers together. So private int, so not accessible outside the script, we're going to be returning an integer, its name, and its parameters. A lot of the time you will not want to return anything. We don't always have to return something. And you're going to find there's a lot of instances where you're not. And if you don't plan to return anything, you can just put void right here. Rather than private int, you would say private void add numbers. And this just means that you're not returning anything. So when this method is done, it's just going to stop and not send anything back. This is a good example of that. This one on the past slide where it said private void. We're not returning anything. We're just printing, and then the method is done and returns nothing back here. So the one important thing to remember is that if you are returning something, you do need to have a return statement inside at the end of your script. And this is telling it what specific piece of data to send back to where this method was called from. And if you hit a return inside of your method, it also stops the method from continuing on. So if we had some code after the return, it wouldn't run. So it's really important to make sure that return is at the very end and you don't want anything else to happen afterwards in this. So what happens with that return data? You need something on the other end to catch it. Otherwise, the information will just disappear and it's just gone. There's nothing there for it. So it's just really important to remember, if you're returning something, what is it getting returned to? If you won't necessarily get an error if you call a method that returns something without anything to catch it, it just will disappear. So be very careful about that and just remember. So there's two different ways to do this. You can just create a local variable to catch it. So the example is down here. With that that add numbers, it's going to return an integer. If we call that in start, I made this local variable called added, and I set that equal to add numbers. So what's going to happen is it's going to create this variable, and then it's going to call this. It's going to call add numbers and send 5 and 6, which means it's going to find this down here. It's going to find this method called add numbers, take that 5 and 6, and return them added together. It's going to spit it back out. It's going to spit it back out through that equal sign, and now caught the number 11. We can then print it out down here. We can also call value returning methods inside of, as a stand-in, kind of in a weird way, almost like a variable. The example is over here where we just call debug.log, and rather than having, over here we had that integer, we can just call add numbers with the 5 and the 6 inside of there. So debug.log, what do we need to print? Oh, it hit this method. It's going to find it, take that 5 and 6, add them together. It's going to spit out 11. 11 is going to go back in here, and it's going to print 11 to the console. Oops. One thing to keep in mind with this, when you do this method, we can always do stuff with added later. Like maybe we want to print it, but maybe later on we're going to do something with the data. If you don't catch it into a variable like this, once this is printed, this information is gone. Like it's not accessible anywhere because we're not storing it in a variable. we don't always need to store it in variables, but just be aware that if you do need to do something with that information, you do need to make sure you are storing that return value inside of a variable. I want to take a look at methods in Unity for a few minutes, just to kind of reiterate all the different types of methods and how you would probably see these written out in C#, especially for Unity. So I have my demo project. I made a new methods script and I have it attached to this empty game object. And I have already pre-coded some stuff to kind of go over. I made, let's see, 1, 2, 3 different types of methods with different approaches to them, so we can kind of discuss how they work in here and what we need to take into account with these. So I am just using my start to run all of my stuff, because remember, we do need to call our methods somewhere. Start fires at the start of play, so I know that this is going to run. So any methods I put in here will run one time at the beginning. So I locally made in the start, I made these 2 local variables, first int and set it equal to 4, and second int and I set it equal to 7. And I want to use this add method that doesn't return anything. It's a private void, but it also doesn't have any parameters. So how would I do this? Like how is this going to work? I can't come in here and type, we have first int, second int. If I want to make something to set that equal to, it doesn't understand what first int and second int are. It says this name does not exist in the current context because they are scoped locally to start. So if it was defined in start, my other methods don't know what that means. So how can we work around this? Well, there's 2 different ways. We either need to send it as these values as parameters, and we're going to show that. I'm going to show that in the next one. But the other way to get around this would be to make variables that are class level, variables that are scoped to the entire class. So with a little bit of magic, I have that up here, where now inside of here, I now have these 2 variables that are available to anywhere in this script now because they're class level. They're up here outside of any method. The first one I'm calling first class int to make sure that I know that this is a class scoped one for this demonstration, and I set it equal to 10. I then also have this other one called second class int and set that equal to 20, so I can access this now in add. So all I need to do now in add is I'm going to kind of do this in a couple steps. I can make a local variable down here and set that equal to first class int plus second class int. And then I can just print that out. So accessible, I don't have to worry about returns. Some downsides of this. This can be used anywhere in our script. So we really should keep our class level variables things that are important to the whole script, because anywhere in the script it can be altered. What if I accidentally changed it somewhere? Like what if I came up here inside of this one, and before I do that, I changed that to 100, but then another method later needs to use that, but it's expecting this value. So it's not a good practice to get into of making all of your variables at the class level. These should be things that do need to be accessed in multiple places, or maybe you need to save that data so that when a method you're working with ends, you still have that information outside of it that does need to get accessed everywhere. This kind of stuff you get better at the more that you work with methods and you start to kind of get a sense of what should be class level, what should be sent as a parameter, and so on. But if you can't have a parameter in your class, the way that you do need to access things would be to make some class level variables so that you could access them inside of there, since we can't do that because of scope. So the next method that I wrote is this add with parameters. And this takes in, if we look at it down here, one integer for first, a second integer for second. So now I can pass to it whatever information I want. And there are some benefits to doing this as well, not just that we don't need to make class level. If this is always accessing those class level ones, it's kind of stuck at only using this data with how it's set. The nice thing about methods with parameters is we can send it any kind of data multiple times. So I call it first up here. You see I have the add with parameters. I send that first int and second int that are scoped here so that it can access it down here through these variables. But we're not bound to just this. We can send it whatever data. So I call it again with other numbers, and we can call this as many times as we want, giving it any two numbers we want. We're not set to those specific class parameters up there. I'm sorry, class variables up there. It's just whatever we send to it. So that has its advantages of having, I hate to say variables, but basically that we can give it whatever data we want anytime we want. We're not messing with anybody else. The other type that we kind of talked about, and I have it down here, is add with return and parameters. So I didn't do add with return no parameters, but that would just be taking this out. Like you can do these without sending information to it. But the big difference, you see how these are void? This has int here because it's expecting us to return an int. So this part is the same where you just have your parameters, and I just made an int variable here called toReturn, and you can call it whatever you want. I usually just like to make a variable for my return functions that I know I'm going to return eventually. It kind of makes sure that things stay straight in my head, because if you don't have a return, you end up getting an error on here. So just trying to make sure that I recognize that I do need to return something. And you can always set this up ahead of time when you're writing these, where you just write like int, give it a variable and just return that variable so you don't get this error. Because it says, there's not all code paths return of values. So it's just looking for that return and we don't have it. So it takes those, stores it in there, what first and second are added to, and then it returns whatever value is being stored in there. So how did we call this? Up here, I did it both ways just to kind of show you. First, in this method, I did make a new variable to store what gets returned. It's going to catch that variable. So this integer called sum is going to catch this. It's going to call this add with return and parameters. It's going to send first int and second int, and I forgot to print it out. Let me add that real quick. Debug.log sum. So that whatever is stored in here after this goes down here, does all this, returns this, it throws it into sum, print out what's being stored into sum. The other way that we can do this, if we don't need to hold on to whatever the sum is after we print it, we can just call that inside of debug.log. And this will run, it'll call that method with those two numbers. This returns 3000 and it just prints 3000. So those are two different ways that we can do that. So let's take another look down here if you need to look at that. So a lot of different a lot of different approaches to working with methods. I do want to show this to you just so that you are aware with the return stuff. I can call add with return and parameters without this. It's going to run, but it's not really going to do anything because it's going to be returning something and there's nothing here to catch it. So no errors, but just be very careful if you have a method that's returning something. Something needs to happen where it's called to do something with it. Otherwise, it just kind of disappears. The other thing I do want to note with this is if you are working with parameters, it's very important that you actually use those parameters and you use them in the correct order and you use them as the correct data type. If I were to call it with no parameters, I get an error. So if I hover over that, it says there is no argument given that corresponds to required formal parameter first in here. So it's looking for those parameters. What happens if I give it the wrong data type? It's looking for hello. I'm going to give it these two strings. I'm getting an error because it says that it cannot convert string to int because it's looking for our string. It's looking for an int. We're sending it a string. What if I just put in one number and not the second one? I get an error again that it doesn't have anything for a second. So I do need to make sure that that I am putting in the correct parameters with these. So hopefully this kind of helps show you a little bit more about methods in a more practical sense. Remember though, this wasn't meant to be like a follow along demo. There is a whole separate video to do method demos. So if you need some more practical, make sure you watch the video and follow along with the practical one. I do want to talk a little bit about those Unity-centric methods just to kind of reiterate and cement it in your head. But the two that we work with all the time is going to be that start method. You're probably very familiar with it now, and our update method. One thing to keep in mind is that the start method is Unity-centric. That means that this is for Unity. If you do try to do C# outside of Unity, start doesn't exist. You have to do things in other ways. So if you are looking at just pure C# stuff, be aware of that. So start method runs the first frame when the script is enabled. And for most of the stuff we're doing right now, that just means when you hit the play button. And it's important, again, remember that normally methods won't run unless they're called. So that's why start is a really good method to use to call other methods inside, so that when the game starts and it hits here, you can kind of, cascade other methods firing because we know start's running. So what other methods do you want to run and execute at the start of the script? So usually when you do start getting into game development, though, what the types of things that you put into start are things like updating the look of the screen to start. You can set your class level variables in start. So for instance, I had those first and second ones. If I didn't put a value in there when I defined them, the first thing I could have done in my start method was say that first class int is equal to something so that it gets set at the very beginning of my script. You can also usually get like player controllers ready and stuff like that. So things that need to kind of be initialized in your script can be done in your start method. The update method is the other one you might work with in Unity, and this fires as your game runs. You're seeing updates multiple times per second. You might have heard this referred to as frames per second or FPS, and this can be as low as 30. For games, you really don't want to ever go below 30 frames per second, but modern machines, and if you have a really efficient game, you can run games at hundreds of frames per second. So you have to make sure any code you put in there is something that you want to execute that many times. So if you're calling methods in there, it's, does that method need to be called 30 to 100 times a second? Probably our add script does not need to go in there, because we don't need to add the same two numbers 30 to 100 times a second. Usually you save the update for things like looking for a mouse or keyboard input. So something that could possibly change at any moment in time and is really critical to catch that change, in less than a second to get that kind of functionality. Okay, so hopefully this kind of helped you understand methods a little bit better. I would highly recommend that you work with the demo next so that you can have some hands-on. If you have this class seated or synchronous, we are going to be doing those demos live in class. So we'll be doing them in class, but there will also be a recorded version of those demos for you to go back and work with.